Before I made games in Unity, I was creating small browser games. Back in those days, I didn't know how to upload games, nor was I even aware of the concept of a game engine. I was just super excited to learn that I could actually make games myself. Among my first projects were a side-scrolling racing game, a top-down shooter, a pseudo 3D racing game, a paint program, Village Quest. Even though I could upload them now, I don't want to. They were more learning experiences than they were games, except for one series in particular. It is my most memorable game development project, and I'd like to share its story. When I first started making games in 2013, I had never coded before. I was browsing the web one day when I stumbled across a site intended to teach beginners how to make games in something called JavaScript. It piqued my interest, so I decided to follow along with the tutorial. My first ever game was really just a reskin of that tutorial. Fast forward just a little bit, and I had created a game where you walk around and take stuff to a stone platform and exchange them for money. It was called Adventure World at the time, and I consider it my first true game. That game would be forgotten until a few months later. To understand what happened next, you'll need some context. A long time ago, when I was just a young kid, I made up a cartoon about a dog named Molly and a mouse named Mouse that went on adventures and saved the world. It was inspired by some toys I had, some tiny stuffed dogs from McDonald's Happy Meals, and a cat toy. The world of Mouse and Molly was a world where dogs and a single mouse were the only inhabitants. Molly was a dog, a brave adventurer, and Mouse's best friend. Mouse was a shy but incredibly intelligent scientist who was always coming up with new inventions. Molly had a brother named Bart and friends named Max and Seth. I would draw storyboards all the time with some silly and incoherent plots. That, too, was all but forgotten until I revisited Adventure World sometime in 2013. I decided to reskin the game with sprites I had drawn up based on Mouse and Molly. I was really pleased with how it looked, and it got me motivated. Fast forward to 2014, and I had my first fully fledged game, Adventure World. It is also where I first started making music. I wanted music for my game, and in searching for a way to make some, I discovered Anvil Studio, and I've used it ever since. I should warn you that my music from that time was, well, listen for yourself. Anyway, about the game. In Adventure World, you play as a dog named Molly in a place called the River Valley. Some evil force is invading and it's up to you to stop it. You know, your typical fantasy game plot. You head into town and talk to Mouse. It's from him that you discover of the invasion and start your quest. Mouse warns you about the monsters and urges you to get some weapons. He mentions that there are treasures scattered throughout the River Valley that can be exchanged for money. I bet you can guess where that mechanic came from. And that's where the adventure starts. You are tasked with retrieving these treasures and bringing them back to the town to exchange for money. In the game, you don't actually have to exchange them. The money is just added to your inventory for each treasure you collect. There are 10 treasures in total. The first 9 can be found in Grass Plains and Shade Plains, and the 10th treasure is obtained by defeating the mini-boss found in the Floodplain. You can buy solutions from the shop in town. The healing solution can be used to heal yourself in combat. The harming solution is thrown at enemies to damage them and is the player's only attack. There are also 4 armors: bronze, silver, gold, and titanium. Once you have at least 100 harming solutions and gold armor, you can continue to the final areas of the game by crossing the floodplain. The final areas are collectively known as the Final Trials. The first is called New River Valley, which is where an expansion to River Valley Town is being built. There isn't actually anything in this area. The next one is the Unexplored. There's some enemies in this area, but defeating them isn't required to move on. The final area of the Final Trials is called the Battlefield. It is just like the previous area in that you don't have to defeat the enemies. After the Battlefield is the final boss fight. Unfortunately, it's honestly a huge disappointment compared to the rest of the game. If you have 100 harming solutions, you can just hold C and the boss will be dead in a second before it even has a chance to reach you. Otherwise, you will inevitably die and respawn in the clinic in River Valley Town. A lot more work could have been put into the end of the game, but it wasn't. I'll get to how that happened later. Though the original game is a bit of a disappointment, the sequel has and always will be my favorite. Adventure World 2 added a whole lot more to the series. It made Molly's brother, Bart, a companion character. It added weapons and new mechanics. It improved how the player transitions to other areas. It added way more characters, and it improved the combat and made it more fun. Of course, it has its flaws too, but I'll get to those later. In between the end of the first game and the start of the second, River Valley Town had been expanded and became River Valley City. More people had moved in. These were the other characters from the original cartoon as well as various NPCs. All was good in the River Valley until the day of the inciting incident of the second game. While expanding the city, some workers were ambushed by monsters. Word got to Molly's village by way of a frightened explorer who had witnessed the event, and thus the adventure begins again. The game starts out by telling you what's new. You then gain control of Molly and discover two things immediately. The characters have animations, and Bart follows you. You can talk to him to learn that you need to go to River Valley City and talk to Mouse. Sound familiar? There are no enemies hunting you down on your walk through grass plains this time, and you enter River Valley City to be greeted by music that is much less obnoxious, at least to me. After entering Mouse's home, you next discover that interiors now have pleasant lighting. You also learn that once again, it's up to you to fight the invasion. This time around, you aren't tasked with collecting treasures, but instead with heading over to your friend Max's weapon shop. At the weapon shop, you talk to Max and browse his selection. You have just enough money to buy the Launcher A. It uses pellets like your slingshot, but it hurts more and is more accurate. These attributes increase for the next two launchers. The Super Gun takes bullets and packs a punch, but for a hefty price of $10,000. The Stellar Gun costs double and is the most powerful weapon in the game. You can also buy armor and health kits. Of course, you could just buy a ton of pellets instead and try to go through the game using your slingshot. However, I don't advise that. After you talk to Max, you need to go back to Mouse because he forgot some very important details. Mouse tells you that you can't actually get to where you need to go on foot. You need to go through a long cave to get there. Thanks, Mouse. After your conversation with Mouse, the game really begins. Once you get to the cave, you and Bart are forced to split up. Molly must explore the cave alone while Bart looks for another possible route to the destination that he can use to meet up with you. After fighting your way through the cave system, you end up in Fort Arohedron. Arohedron is a word I made up, and it's the name of the greater area that the River Valley is located in, making it the Arohedron River Valley. The enemies in the fort serve as a kind of mini-boss. By defeating them all, you destroy the main invasion and rescue the explorer that came to your village. He leads you to Arohedron Seaport, where you reunite with Bart. You explore the seaport until you encounter a dock worker who knows the location of the villain. You head down a dark tunnel, and when you reach the end, you find that you can turn right and return to earlier areas. If you choose to do so, you can return to the tunnel by simply entering the cave again. Upon defeating the final boss, Mouse calls to you. You follow him and meet up with all of the other characters from the game. They are all standing around a strange object that someone found, a crashed spaceship. Everyone discusses it, and then Mouse comes up with a plan. He proposes that the gang use it as a method of travel so that they can protect the entire world, thus setting up a sequel. The game ends with everyone agreeing and going home. What's the gameplay this time around, you may ask? Well, it's complicated. My intention was for it to be exploration and fighting enemies. Unfortunately, due to some poor planning during development, you spend some of your time in the game fighting with the other poorly designed mechanics. One of the new mechanics is the energy bar. It drains as you run around and do things, and you will faint if it reaches 0. Energy is restored by eating food. You buy ingredients from a store in the city and prepare meals at your home. This mechanic isn't well balanced though, and managing your energy ends up being tedious and annoying. The next problem is the biggest one in the whole game, the grinding. The only ways to make money are to ask Mouse for cash from time to time, which is a terribly slow source, and collecting bonus packs. Bonus packs. They're collectibles that are scattered around grass plains and shade plains that give you money, pellets, and ammo, as well as restoring your health and energy. Unfortunately, they were very poorly implemented. The thing is, there's technically only one bonus pack. Its first location is always directly to the left after you first enter Grass Plains, but after you collect it, it respawns in a random location, randomly picking which of the two areas to appear in. This wouldn't be so bad if it weren't your only reliable source of money, but it is. In the early game, the amount of grinding required to advance from the Launcher C to the Super Gun was pure torment. I realized this during development and addressed it by putting a super special collectible in Arohedron Seaport. It is a golden bonus pack, which gives you $15,000. However, there's still a painful amount of grinding if you want to get the Stellar Gun, which makes defeating the final boss much easier. Speaking of the final boss, I think it makes up for all the grinding. It is a tough battle, but it's actually interesting. You have to avoid dangerous projectiles that are being launched at you. Occasionally, a fast and deadly projectile gets launched. In the second phase, those projectiles become more common as the boss nears defeat. Also, if you die, the boss's health doesn't reset, and you can return to the battle exactly where you left off. This may sound like it makes the battle too easy, but I've never been able to defeat the boss in one go myself, so I like it. So what's the final verdict? Adventure World 2 certainly has its flaws, but I find it to be a far superior game to the original. If I'm being honest, Adventure World 1 is unfinished. It really shows in the later part of the game. So why was it unfinished? The reason is that I actually began development of the sequel before the first game was completed. I had big goals for the next game, things I was sure I wanted in a separate game. Adventure World 2 quickly took priority, and the original was rushed. But what about the problems with the second game? I attribute those to being new to game design. I had lots of cool ideas, but I didn't know the best way to execute them. I still think I did a pretty good job considering my experience up to that point. I know how I'd fix those problems today though. For example, in the first game, I would have required you to beat all the enemies in each of the final trials areas in order to proceed to the next, as well as fleshing the areas out. I would have also made the player's interactions with the boss more dynamic, like giving it specific attacks instead of contact damage. As for the second game, I would have replaced the bonus packs with fun side quests. So why don't I go back and do those things then? Well, for starters, my JavaScript is already really rusty, and I would be way too preoccupied with trying to optimize everything else in those games. I would just be better off remaking them in Unity. So why don't I do that? Well, if I were to do that, I would just start from scratch, combining the best of both adventure worlds and my proposed fixes to make a masterpiece. Then I would build the game I always wanted, equipped with my valuable experience in Unity and C#. And I may just do that someday. If that sounds like something you would like to see, please let me know. And thanks for watching. I leave you with the Adventure World 2 theme, composed in 2015.